I am Dr. Amanda Hagee. I am from Biomedical Sciences, the Department of Biomedical Sciences at the School of Medicine at UND. And I am here to talk to you guys a little bit about flexible deadlines and if they actually help our students learn. So this is quite a bit of data from when I taught online. So we're particularly looking in an online context here. So some of you may know me. I've presented at this conference before, but in case you don't, I was brought into at UND to redesign our undergraduate anatomy and physiology offerings. So these are large enrollment classes that serve all of our kind of pre-health majors. Um, and we previously had a standalone anatomy course, a standalone physiology course, and I was brought in to redesign this into a 2-semester sequence that proceeds based on organ systems. So I'm not going to go through all of my course design kind of bits today because I really want to focus in on this idea of flexible deadlines. But I did want to give you an overview of this is kind of what the course looks like. I call my units badges. I like to use a typical like you got to catch them all kind of organ system approach. And when we did this redesign, all of the content of the courses was aligned with the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, or HAPS, learning outcomes. So nationally standard learning outcomes for each one of these kind of badges. Students progress through over two semesters. They do 7 badges in the first semester, starting with intro, and then they do 7 badges in the second semester, starting with endocrine here. So, when I came in 2019, I essentially spent a year designing these courses while teaching our standalone anatomy course. And so then they launched in fall of 2020. So I actually launched the new design of my courses online because of COVID. But we were online, we're solely online for a year, just like kind of everybody was. But then after that, starting in kind of fall of 21, the courses grew enrollment, grew in interest, and I ended up doing 3 different modalities. So from essentially fall 2020 until last fall, actually, through spring 2024, I was the only person teaching anatomy and physiology at UND, and so I was the only person teaching across 3 different modalities. So this gives a unique opportunity to do a lot of comparison that kind of takes the instructor variability out of the equation. All of the courses, like I said, are all 3 modalities, same content, same HAPS objectives, but they did have, the differences kind of dictated by modality. So I tried to summarize these here, and I've also used 3 different icons. So for whatever modality we're talking about, you'll see these little icons in the corner of the slides. Now, the in-person teaching icons on PowerPoint are always like somebody standing in front of the room, which is kind of deeply upsetting, I think, for our theme today. But my in-person sections are flipped. They are active learning, they are team-based, and my students essentially have daily quizzes, daily due dates, and this kind of constant content drip. So like a typical flipped classroom, they're responsible for watching lectures and doing some sort of pre-assignment. They're supposed to come in prepared. In class, we are doing team-based activities. Every single class period ends with a quiz, and then every single organ system, intro cells, tissues, what have you, ends with an exam. So then I also taught 2 different online modalities at the same time. So I've turned like the way I've described them is online term versus what we call SPIA, which is self-paced enroll anytime. So that's where that acronym comes from. So the online term-based are, it is still contained within a fall or spring semester. The difference kind of between these, again, content's all the same. The fact that they have a chunk of time to do a certain organ system, a certain badge is roughly the same, but all the content's released at once. So they don't have the structure of class periods, it's asynchronous, it is individual, and then we'll talk about my extensions to those due dates kind of within that context here in a little bit. So then the online term-based is different from the self-paced enroll anytime courses because those are kind of, as the name implies, you are not confined by a semester. Students enroll in these at any point. They have 9 months to complete them, and there are 0 due dates besides those 9 months with a slight bit of extension. But it's a very choose your own adventure, choose when you're going to get content done, and like move through the course at your own pace for it. Okay, so in the very first comparison across these different modalities is that the grade distributions are particularly disparate for it. So the way I've kind of set up these slides too, there's a lot of data tables for things with a lot of different percents and distributions. So I have tried to highlight particular conclusions in our UND Kelly Green on the slides here. So the kind of take-home message here is that my in-person students through the years, so here we're looking at kind of everything's consistently taught between fall or summer of 22 through spring of 2024, all 3 different modalities. My in-person students are particularly successful. Lots of A's and B's, very low DFW rate. Our standalone courses used to have a 40% DFW rate, and my in-person sections hover around 2 or 3%. But this is different than both the online term semester and the SPIA courses, where you definitely see a decrease in that success levels and an increase in those DFW rates, particularly with the SPIA courses. Those are specifically increased, but even in our online term semesters, right, our A percentage is decreasing and shifting more to the B and C range. So overall, same content, same me, but students in those different modalities, in the online modalities particularly, were less successful at this point. So kind of getting into a little bit of the meat of why students are less successful and what some of the reasons are behind some of that grade distribution. I started specifically looking at the SPIA courses. So again, these are the self-paced enroll anytime courses. So they are, what they buy is essentially 9 months to complete the content. So the average number of weeks is significantly different between students that are A, Bs, and Cs compared to our Ds and Fs in terms of completing the course. So they're still, I think it's important to note, outside of a normal semester. Normal semester is 16 weeks. My SPIA students take on an average of 26 to 28 weeks. And then I mentioned that they can also extend this. So when they do it within the 9 months, they get a typical letter grade, A, B, or C. They can purchase a one-time extension for 3 months, and then that marks on their transcript with a incomplete until it is, they finish it within theirs. So that's how you go from being an A to an AI. So an AI would be the ones that finished it outside of the 9 months, but still finished the content. So the percent of students that extended 10 to 13% for those A and Bs. And then you can also see we have a higher percentage in the D and F range. We have 25 to 17%. But I think important to note with those is they either they bought the extension and either didn't finish the course to its completion, hence the D and the Fs, or they did at a less successful rate. But for most of these, kind of looking through myself for it, it is students not finishing the course for these high DFW rates in the SPIA courses. So before I move on to my online term data, I do want to just note some of the concerns with the SPIA courses. Students pay for these out of pocket. They are charged that fee for the extension use, and We had a very high withdrawal rate, as you see, and there are some extra pressures in those courses as an instructor. I would say over teaching these courses for 3 years, I think some of my least favorite interactions occurred with SPIA students who are requesting to go exceptionally fast through the course, expecting grading to occur within 24 hours, largely driven from the fact that they had these conditional acceptances into PA programs, nursing programs, etc. So they're looking for something to fill very, very fast. Um, and close to the end of their extension timelines, so close to the end of those due dates too for it. So I'll leave those at that, just that this kind of idea that our free, open, choose your own adventure model, our students, while some students do appreciably well in it, do tend to have less success in that style of course. Okay, so then moving on to my online term-based course, I just wanted to cover what those extensions that I mentioned look like. So this is a graphic that I use to communicate my course schedule to students. So they have a particular set of time to complete each badge, right? And then they have a due date for these. Now, all of the literature and kind of just inherently, we kind of know students are choosing online courses usually for their flexibility. And so having those hard deadlines, I attempted to also provide some flexibility with them instead of, dealing with constant requests to move those deadlines on an individual basis. I built in a system where essentially students could request to have a 2-day extension to those due dates or a 1-week extension for these due dates, with the note that the semester is the semester, right? So for these online term-based courses, they do have a end date that everything has to be done by. So each one of these kind of badge due dates, you can see they could move by 2 days or they could move by a week. And I used a survey system to kind of set up that structure for things. Okay, so do flexible deadlines actually help students? So that's where we get into the meat of like, how did students interact with these extensions? So interestingly, a majority of students used the extensions, and that didn't really significantly change across grades. So you can see my ABCDF distribution here. 75%, 80% of students are using extensions throughout the course. And then the second table indicates the number of extensions based on type. So the averages of how many 2-day extensions does student use? How many week-long extensions does student use? So looking at those averages, you can see most students used 1 or 2 2-day extensions. And then the average for week-long extensions was more like 3, 4 week-long extensions. So just to note that this is out of 6 possible extensions, right? There's 7 badges. You can't actually move the last one because that's the end of the semester. But the other 6, you could request a 2-day or 1-week extension here. So the extension use does not correlate with grades, but students typically use the 1-week extensions more so than the 2-day extensions. The other, besides just grades, and looking at extensions not matching, correlating with any sort of grade outcome, I've also done an objective or an attempted objective measure for A&P knowledge called the HAPS exam. So again, when I redesigned the courses, the learning outcomes were aligned with the HAPS learning outcomes, and they offer a standardized exam that covers a typical 2-semester sequence that measures essentially students' knowledge of their learning outcomes. And I think I presented this data last year. So my in-person students, typically achieve at around what the national level is. The national average is about 47. So we are right there. And interestingly, there's no difference in HAPS exam averages between in-person and online. So even though we have this large difference in grade distribution, the overall HAPS exam score is not different. It's also not different across whether they used extensions throughout the course or not. Now, whenever I present HAPS exam data, I also always throw in a little caveat here that there are some issues with using them. Again, I don't get to see any of these questions for it. It's a national standardized exam that comes with all of the problems of what standardized exams are. And how they are implemented across different courses. So comparing to the national average is completely variable. Even in my own course, right? It's not a full, all of the points matter, right? Because we don't know the outcomes for it. So it was built into their grading scheme with a little bit of extra credit for it. So how seriously they take it, I think, is also a asterisk to put on this data. But overall, we're not seeing any different with extension use or between in-person and online. The major thing I was able to track with the use of these extensions is the timing of their use throughout the semester. So the online, so this tracks through the badges that students see, intro cells, tissue, skin, skeletal muscles, the first semester, right? And so you can see the students, the number of students that are not using any extensions, which is the blue bar, decrease through the semester, and the number of students using those 1 week extensions increases throughout the semester. And we see this little dip where we get close to the end, and I think there's a little like, oh no, the end is coming and I have to like get my stuff back together here. So we kind of see this dip and rise in the first semester. We see it also in the second semester. Where you have this decrease of no extensions and then the increase of 1 semester. So extension use does seem to correlate with timing during the semester here. And it's important to show you both the first and second semester because I think to consider content difficulty may be a play in here. So just someone who's familiar with the content, right? Intro cells and tissues are all quite easy. So is skin, and then skeletal and muscle is really when you start to feel it in first semester. But second semester, I would say, is consistently quite difficult for students with the physiology. And we still see that pattern of increasing extension use as we move throughout the semester. But interestingly, those extension uses does not change like exam scores. So again, same color scheme, no extensions is blue. You have your 2 days in red, which is not a lot of students, and then the 1 weeks in the yellow. And the exam scores across the different badges are all pretty comparable for things. And I will note that the exam scores for my online sections, just like the overall grades distribution, is significantly lower than my in-person. So we're averaging around a 70% exam score in the online courses, even a little bit lower in second semester. My in-person exam scores are usually somewhere between 78, 80% for things. So significantly lower, but doesn't seem to change with extension use here. And then just keep going through some of our data. Again, a bit of negative data here. We've kind of classically known that students in some different majors struggle a little bit more, decreasing that 8%, particularly thinking about our nursing students, which make up a sizable chunk, somewhere around 25% of our overall student population. They typically struggle in A&P a little bit more, with a higher DFW rate and a lower A rate for it. But per major, extension use didn't really change with those, kind of focusing on our major question here. All of the majors, typically most of students, about 75%, 80% of students consistently used those kind of extensions. The same kind of goes for year. So I ended up looking at the year breakdown and the major breakdown specifically for our nursing faculty, as our program A&P is required for our nursing program, and our nursing students come in earlier than our other students. Our nursing students typically start our A&P 1 as second semester freshmen. And so freshmen nursing students do not as well in A&P for it. So again, looking by year here, the freshmen have this shifted distribution down from the significant other ones, but similar to our major story, right? Extension use doesn't really seem to correlate with that. Again, most students used extensions and it doesn't really correlate with their overall grade outcomes. Okay, so that's kind of thinking about extensions for it. Towards the end of me teaching online as a modality, I wanted to implement a practice exam. So if we think all the way back to my in-person course design, I said I do daily quizzes. So my in-person students, they have a daily quiz, and then those quiz questions are essentially exam questions for their end of the badge exam. And so I hadn't really replicated that level of practice for my online students. So fall 23 and spring 24, I wanted to introduce these practice exams. So similarly, I gave students a practice exam that was about 20 questions. And again, that gives them an example of the types of questions they're going to see on the exam. And so that was built in online where you had the practice exam and then the main exam. But again, all of that chunk of content is due by a certain date that you can extend by 2 days or 1 week. So these graphs I find interesting. So you're looking at the practice exam versus the practice score. So those were 10-point practice exams, so lower stakes, also with less points, versus the main exam score versus time. So when we're looking at that time, the 0 line is the original due date for those exams. So you can see the dots on the right are the students that are taking it before the original due date. Dots on the left are the students taking it at some sort of extension here, right? And so there doesn't seem to be a huge correlation in score, I think, looking at the scatter plots. But if we significantly divide these up, because I think we had to change the windows and how we were thinking about this. So in the green box, I have kind of boxed out everybody that's within either before or within 48 hours of the due date. So within that 2-day extension, really, those are your box of students. Now, the other box, the red box, you can see that they're quite lined up over time. So 168 hours is a 7-week or 7-day shift. It's the 1-week extension. So you can significantly see students are turning in their practice exams and their main exams essentially right in time, very like last minute. And so we split out the scores for these two different groups of students of when they're turning in the exams. You can see that in that green box, so within 48 hours or before of the due date, we have a higher success rate, particularly for the main exam. Practice exams are about the same for it, but the main exams, we have a higher percentage achievement there, whereas the students, particularly turning in these exams very last minute, particularly the bigger, main, beefier exam, we have a significantly lower average at that point. And for this, I chose our skeletal exam. Again, kind of thinking about content, thinking about one of our harder exams, thinking about the fact that we're further into the semester, at it as kind of an example. This data is kind of replicated across a lot of those different badges, with kind of the beginning and the ends being like a little bit weird in terms of timing. And with those practice exams, so what I tried to convey to students was that, the point of the practice exams is that you get practice and then you can review them, analyze your gaps in knowledge, trying to give them the same kind of experience that I have in my online sections, right? But interestingly, this graph shows the main exam score by the time in between students taking the practice exam and the main exams. And so what we repeatedly saw was that most students are doing this hours, if not minutes, between each other. And they're very close to the end of the due date. So that last extension due date comes around, you've got a couple hours until that comes up. You are taking the practice exam, you're maybe spending a couple minutes reviewing it, then you're taking the main exam right away. Where it's not all students, but we're definitely hitting like a 50-60% where they're not taking very much time in between those. So looking about how that interacts with the literature, so literature on flexible deadlines is definitely newer. A lot of studies between 2022 and now. So I found this really interesting meta analysis and kind of review of flexible assessment, so in types of assessment, but also sections on deadlines and multiple attempts, right? So that review pretty much said that this flexibility in deadlines and numbers and attempts has been considered an essential strategy for students, and that there are a lot of research studies that are looking at student perception wherein they encounter flexible deadlines and number of attempts and seeing that it reduces student stress, increases their feelings of autonomy, and generally students like having flexible deadlines. But then I found a more recent case study that I think aligns a little bit better with my experience that looked at, similar to mine, that students are not necessarily capitalizing on that increase in flexibility, and that despite knowing that students perceive it as something that reduces their stress, we don't actually have measured outcomes of how flexible deadlines are benefiting students. But mostly we're seeing students adapt to a perceived deadline instead of maybe planning it out and using that necessarily to their advantage. So some of my conclusions, at least from the data that I looked at, that overall students are less successful. They use extensions a lot. They don't seem to really correlate with grades and exam scores, except for when you consistently turn things in last minute. So I think I'll end there, answering the question of my title, right? Do flexible deadlines actually help students? I'm not sure I have an answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts and questions about it. Oh, we got a request back to our conclusions. That QR code should also take you to a copy of my slides. Okay, so just looking at the Q&A questions, and feel free to interrupt me if there's questions in the
Hey,
room.
Amanda,
Oh,
can you
yep.
hear me now?
Yes.
We were muted. So, it's Danielle Condry.
Oh, hi, Danielle.
Thank you for presenting all this data. I'm really curious because the research that you found, as well as what you're finding, is like confounding.
Mhm.
How are you going to go about teasing this apart? Because I think a lot of us are trying flexible deadlines and, like you said, not knowing whether they're really having an impact, a positive impact on student learning. So
Yeah.
what's next?
Okay, great. Because I was definitely, I think, like most of you, right? I just got out of the semester. I put the data together, and I'm like, "Oh, this is a lot of negative data." um, but interestingly, actually, I think an idea might come from another anonymous attendee in the Q&A said something about looking at maybe persistence in the course. So, is looking at like the withdrawal rates or students' ability to like, if I didn't have this deadline, I would have dropped it because I would be failing, I think would be an interesting measure to get at that I should have the data to look at. And that may be, worthwhile looking at. Because I still think the way the previous research is presented, as in it's giving students these unique opportunities to time manage. I think we're always interpreting that as like better like proper time management in our minds, right? But like sometimes they just have to get through it. So are we giving students the opportunity to like, get by and maybe apply those lessons later on? So I think some of that, and then asking students like, I wish I had a more robust qualitative piece to this too, of like, how did you like, maybe you didn't use it the best this time, but like your lessons from applying like flexible deadlines, how did that change how you approach things in the future? Maybe might be because we learn things by not doing them well sometimes too.
I have a question that's maybe sort of related to what you were just saying. Did you see anything in the literature about professional success of like in
Mhm.
employment when students have had flexible deadlines? I think that's one of the things that some that I've had some concerns about is translating. You have all this flexibility and not a real deadline, and then when you get to the workplace, you maybe actually do have actual deadlines.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't recall seeing anything. So if anybody has an answer to that, I'd love to hear it. It's one of the things that I find challenging with this work is like doing that kind of tracking. So I think there's in education as a whole, it's really hard to track our students into outcomes like later down the road that we'd really like to see. So I think again thinking about it, even if we can track it into like the next course, particularly when you're going from lower level courses to upper level courses of like I was given these opportunities and these flexibilities and these kind of pieces, right? So now what did I learn to like take with me? So I haven't seen anything, but I would love to.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions in the room?
Just because there's a couple on chat, particularly about ungrading. So this work, I think in particular, has increased my interest in like ungrading for it. So I have not done much with it. But I think just, spitballing a little bit, and we talked in the like keynote earlier about how our students are different now. I think our students are different, and I think that's an area like I personally feel like I need to explore a lot more to respond to that difference in student population now.
In some cases, that students really appreciate when they get the extension under the stress of other things, especially if the major is very tough with big projects and stuff. The feedback to the professors appreciate that, and
Mhm.
another group of students did not appreciate that. So how we deal as a faculty to manage that kind of stress and extension?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. The way you communicate it, which is also another question in the Q&A, is like how I communicated it. I would say I tried very, very hard of being like, this is the schedule as it should be. The extensions should be an exception, not the rule kind of thing. And I've seen some very different schematics where people use like extension banks and that kind of thing. So there may be something in there of like, it's there when you need it, but it's not what you should be doing all the time. And I don't know if I have a full answer of like how to communicate, like to convince them, right? And I don't know if we can. Versus here it is. Hopefully you use it, you don't use it, but you need to like learn from that flexibility. Because I think also tying back to the professional outcomes, I mean, flexibility is a little bit, I would say, more our norm than not, at least for academia and things. And then what deadlines are real, what deadlines aren't, and navigating that nuance is important.
One more question in the room here. Just a second.
I don't know if you'll know the answer to this question or have access to the data you need to kind of answer it, but my thought is, okay, so if I offer deadlines in extensions in my course, and then there are 3 other instructors in their other courses are also giving extensions, then like you mentioned this idea of time management with the extension. So if all of those extensions are happening in the same time in 4 different courses, have you seen anything with that data? Like, is that more overwhelming with students? Because now all of a sudden that hard deadline is gone and there's just like floating deadlines in 4 separate courses. So like I said, I don't know if you know the answer to that, but I just was curious.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've thought about that I should be able to do is look at like a majority of my students are all taking the same courses, right? Of like that dip in the semester of like how much is that because all of our deadlines are the same for it. And I know this colloquially from talking to students, right? Well, I have 3 exams this day. I'm like, yeah, that sucks. You should be able to like, let's move one by like a little bit for it. But I think you're right. And there is definitely some literature out there of like that choice architecture and being overwhelming in terms of choices that they need some more guidance. I just don't know if I've seen anybody be like, and this is the guidance that they need to be able to figure out how to do this for it. Yeah, I think that communication piece, I don't know, maybe the answer, and it might just be like sometimes you have to do stuff by this deadline. So,
I don't see any other questions in the room. I'm not sure if there are any. Oh, there's one more in, it looks like there's one more in the Q&A. A few in the Q&A. Can you see them?
Yes, yep.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I've tried to touch on a couple of those as I'm talking for it. I should probably type out answers. So how I tracked it, that's a simple, so I used a Qualtrics form. So in order to move their deadline, they had to fill out like, okay, I want to move my deadline. I want to move it by 2 days or 1 week, like per badge for it. So I did use like a survey system to make my life easier as well. So it's not just emails for it. And so then I was able to use that going back.
Thank you all for coming today.